Mario!
Luigi's Mansion is one of my favorite games on the Nintendo GameCube. If you haven't realized, in the past 2 months I've made 2 videos on it, if that's not a clear sign. Now the thing about Luigi's Mansion is there's a lot of cool hidden things within it. And the thing I'm talking about today is something you can't find online. It's something I discovered while making my 2 previous Luigi Mansion videos, so I'm pulling it out of the old Swanky vault to share with all of you. So here's the thing, there's a way to spawn a black hole or multiple black holes around Luigi's Mansion, and it pretty much destroys the game, and it prevents you from progressing any further. It's really weird. So first we need to set the stage. Like all good internet mysteries, context is super important. And for those of you who watched my last Luigi's Mansion video about the lost coins that are out of bounds, then you might be familiar with this approach, but regardless, we need to talk about Luigi's Mansion and how it's laid out, because that will come into play later on when we talk about the process. So Luigi's Mansion is built in layers. You have 5 floors, seemingly. You have the basement, the first floor, the second floor, the third, and you have the roof. And there are certain rooms in this mansion that also spawn across multiple floors. Most rooms take place on 1 floor, but there are some that branch across 2. An obvious example would be the first room in the game, the foyer, or foyer. I'm from Ohio, so sue me. But the foyer has a staircase, and when you walk up that staircase, the objects at the top of the staircase begin to load once they get into Luigi's view. So there's a loading process within the game taking place. Now, if you pull up your Game Boy Horror at any time, obviously the room's gonna be fully rendered. Regardless if you're on the bottom floor or the top floor, you're gonna see the room completely rendered out, which is different than the fixed camera view that Luigi normally has. But I want you to think about that concept for a little bit longer. The act of loading and unloading rooms, whether through doors or through navigating different layers in the mansion. Now, what's interesting about Luigi's Mansion is that the whole game takes place on a grid. There are rooms that are stacked upon each other, and they're basically a giant rectangle or square. And certain rooms in the mansion are probably taller than you think. Like for the observatory, for example, takes place on floor 2, but actually it stretches up all the way to floor 3 and the roof. Same thing with the graveyard. If you go to the graveyard or the outside area, obviously you're taking place on floor 1, unless you're on the little patio with Toad, which takes place on floor 2. However, graveyard and backyard space for floor 3 and roof exist. And the thing is, if we use codes in the game, we can actually have free movement amongst these areas. So we could be on floor 3 in the graveyard and actually just walk straight onto the roof. And that's really where things get interesting for this whole concept we're talking about. So let's go back to the unloading and loading process I was talking about before. As Luigi navigates through the mansion, when he goes through doors, the game naturally unloads objects that he just left and loads the objects that are in the room he's going into. So what's happening during this process is that the game is cycling out the memory. Basically, it's doing this so it doesn't overload. It gets rid of the information it doesn't need, and it gains the information that it needs for the new room. So it's a system of checks and balances, so the game doesn't overload or start dropping frames, so it's able to process everything going on. But what if we start messing with that functionality, that loading and unloading process? What if we sort of interrupt that behavior? So in a lot of speedruns, you probably have seen what I'm about to explain on a smaller scale. Basically, in the game, people go to Chauncey, the baby's area, they defeat the boss, and when the chest is spawning in the room, they force Luigi inside of it, which then pushes Luigi into the wall. At this point, they're now outside of the room, inside the wall, and can navigate around the mansion and basically fall to the basement below. And this allows them to finish the game really fast. Obviously, this is used for speedruns. But during this example, people are loading and unloading rooms at an increased rate, and also by not using a door. So what happens in that speedrun is actually the beginning of this concept, because you're interrupting that process, you're interrupting that loading process. But what just happened is only one cycle. Luigi falls from floor 2 to the basement, cycling out a couple different rooms, and then that's the end of it. But we need to repeat that process over and over again. But the thing is, repeating the process is only step 1. We need to do this really fast. And the current cycle of that speedrun isn't able to do this because now you can't repeat the process. So for the sake of experimentation, what we're going to do is enable something called a wall hack and a moon jump. So this is going to allow us to walk around the mansion freely without any issues. Now it's important to note that Luigi's Mansion as a whole still has out of bounds areas that you can't get to, even with the wall hack, even with the moon jump. Basically, you have the mansion itself, and it's inside of a black void, and anything in that black void cannot be walked on or even interacted with. So if you were to go to the butler's room, for example, the room at the frontmost left of the mansion, if I tried walking through the wall with the wall hack, I'm actually going to come across an inaccessible barrier, and Luigi is not going to be able to progress past that point. And that exists all around the mansion, up, down, all around. It's basically a box you are contained in. But still, with this ability to freely move around the mansion without having to use doors, basically we can go anywhere we want quickly. We could shoot up to the top floor, we could run across all the floors on the bottom, and by not using the doors, we're going to keep tricking that process over and over again. We're not going to be subtracting from the memory. It's going to be loading too fast for the game to keep up with. And all this starts to really add up. Now, for anyone who ever watched Pan and Coke 2012, I think that's how you pronounce the channel's name, obviously he focuses a lot on Mario 64. And in his Mario 64 videos, he talks about memory spaces in games. In Mario 64, there's a very limited amount of memory, and when objects are loaded or forced to unload, you can actually change the objects in the game by manipulating that memory. So the biggest thing for Luigi's Mansion is that when you're leaving and entering a room, the objects in the room are loading and unloading. Even if you don't use a door, they're going to disappear and they're going to appear. The thing is though, it's actually what I believe is the lighting in the game. So when you enter a room, obviously there's being light cast on the room from above. There's lighting textures that have around the glowing bulbs. Those are the things the game cannot keep up with. And by running this cycle over and over and over again, those lighting textures that are being projected from those bulbs begin to stack up. They begin to duplicate themselves. So it's interesting because they are normally a transparent texture. They have a bright white point in the texture and it sort of fades off to the sides. But it's like if you had a transparent layer in Photoshop and you kept duplicating it over and over and over again. Basically, the faded area is going to become more opaque, less see-through than it was before, because it's stacking up and it's becoming thicker. It's working towards being 100% opaque. So once the game starts trying to keep track of all these different lights that are not unloading from the different rooms, you're going to start seeing squares around the actual lights. You're going to start seeing the game trip out. Alongside these weird lights are going to be these white, glitchy squares that sort of spawn all around the mansion. They look a lot like Missing No from Pokemon. Basically a white square textured with a bunch of random symbols or gibberish. It definitely looks like it's corrupted, but those are going to spawn all around the mansion. So with this whole light show and these glitchy objects, obviously the game is starting to break. But getting to this point isn't quick. It takes several hours of navigating through the rooms and unloading rooms and things of that nature to actually trigger this effect. And the reason why I got to this point was because I was making 2 back-to-back Luigi's Mansion videos, and I was getting a lot of footage around the mansion. And I use these codes and stuff to help navigate and get the shots easier than I would have without them. But at this point, when the lights are going haywire and these glitchy squares are spawning, the game does something really, really bizarre. Anytime Luigi tries to leave the epicenter of the room, what happens is there's a strong current that tries to force Luigi out of bounds. It will literally rip Luigi out of the room and toss him into the void. If it can't do this, basically what's going to do is take Luigi and stick him into the floor where he's stuck forever. But remember earlier on, I told you there was this barrier outside the mansion, this black void that Luigi cannot go through regardless of what he does. It is the absolute container that the mansion is set in, and it's a wall that you cannot get past. However, with this increased velocity, the force that Luigi is ripped out of these rooms actually has the ability to push Luigi beyond, well, the beyond. It allows Luigi to be put into an area that he cannot normally access, well beyond the black void walls that contain the mansion. And what's interesting is, depending on where you are in the mansion or what room you're in, Luigi can get sucked in different directions. Most typically it's towards the camera, but he can get to the left and to the right and further back into the mansion. And usually when that happens, it just spits you into another room. But when it happens towards the front of the mansion, Luigi could be spit out in front of the mansion about 25 feet. Or he could be spit in front of the mansion hundreds and hundreds of feet. And when we open up our Game Boy Horror and check out the map, we can see how far out he actually is. And when this happens, it's game over. You can't do anything. You can't walk. You can't really move at all. You're trapped, forced in one spot forever. But what's interesting is, when this happens, there's a rare chance you can see something kind of strange. A massive treasure chest can spawn below the room that you're in. It's basically like mirrored below the floor. When I say massive, I mean extremely large, like size of the mansion large. It's so large that the game's culling how the game crops out media and stuff it's not using obstructs the full view of it. You can't actually see the whole thing. Why this actually spawns here is beyond me, but I think it has to do with the game overloading its memory, and it creates this object in error. To solidify that reasoning, when you try to pause the game after being sucked out into the void, you don't even get a pause screen. You basically get a solid black screen. And if you try to quit the game and try to go back to the the title screen, you see some really weird things. The memory from the game actually doesn't dump. It doesn't refresh itself. So when you try to boot up the menu and go to file select, everything's looking weird. All the graphics are removed. You just get the blue squares. And if you try to select an actual file, the game will immediately crash. So by manipulating the room loading system within Luigi's Mansion, we're able to create these black holes spawning all around the mansion that can suck Luigi out of it. They spawn in about 75% of the rooms. Certain rooms are unaffected. I couldn't get the black hole effect to trigger in the observatory and some other rooms. I'm not sure why those are safe, but they are. But through this process, Luigi is able to escape the absolute boundaries of the map and be cast out into the void. And this pretty much sums up this black hole experience in Luigi's Mansion. Obviously, I would love to know your thoughts on this, your own personal theory on why this occurs. Is it the game overloading? Is it something else? I will say if you walk through a door or actually navigate through a door, it seems to start unloading the process. The lights are still tripped out, but it doesn't have the same vacuuming effect. But anyways, let me know your thoughts and theories in the comments below. And with that, thanks for tuning in to this Mansion Conundrum. I highly recommend checking out my video about the lost coins of Luigi's Mansion if you enjoyed this one. Anyways, thanks for watching, guys and gals, and until my next video, cheers.